So today we're going to talk about something called Mindsight, which is a word that a long time ago, back in the 80s, I made up because when I was seeing patients here in Los Angeles for the first time as a psychiatry trainee, it seemed to me that what we did in psychotherapy was teach people about how to see their mind and how to shape it in a very different way. And it's funny because I'm seeing some people there who are there during my training years. Hi. And that was a long time ago. We're all look a little different now. But things haven't changed that much, actually, from those days where, in a way, our field in mental health lost its mind. And I say that very sincerely. And when I was in training, I just thought I was learning an odd kind of limited thing in psychiatry. But it turns out in all of our fields, there was this strange absence of a definition of the mind. Now, in the 90s, it was the beginning of the decade of the brain. I had been seeing patients for a while. And so I started running a science group. I don't know if any of you were in it, but it was with 40 scientists, open to the public. But these 40 scientists met for 4 years to discuss the connection between mind and brain. Right? It was a decade of the brain. And what was amazing was those fields didn't have a definition of the mind either. So I had to offer them one that I'm going to offer you now. But with that definition, we could collaborate across scientific disciplines. And it was very exciting to find a commonality across groups that usually didn't speak together. So this idea of Mindsight was born out of clinical practice to say that as mental health practitioners, we could actually take the mental part of our field, mental health, and define what it is, not be just running around without a working definition. And then we could be so bold as to go on to the second part, the health part, and define that. And how many of you in your training had one lecture at least that defined what mental health is? Raise your hand. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So a little bit higher, that's great. And what is the definition of mental health? Okay, well, you're not alone. That's usually the response. Because usually it's either, in the worst of cases, it's the absence of symptoms, of course. And in the best of cases, you get the beautiful work of positive psychology, which is fantastic, to bring us from disorder to descriptions of mental well-being. But interestingly, at least as far as I can do from my reading and listening to the lectures, they don't define mental health, they describe it, which is really, really, really important, has made huge strides in moving us from a pathology model to a health model, but still doesn't give us the underlying mechanism beneath health. So we'll go and describe that too. So Mindsight is the capacity to see the mind and shape it toward health in very specific ways we're going to define. So in this group, what came up was this idea that you could define the mind. And here was the definition I gave to them. And I'll give it to you, but I want to warn you that since using this definition for the last 17 years, it's been very helpful, but I found out that really, really smart scientists who study the mind say that we should never define it. So it's not just mental health practitioners. Scientists of the mind don't want to have a definition. And even people who are really, really, really smart philosophers, who I've had the opportunity to spend lots of time with, who write books with mind in their titles, I'll sit down with them over some wine or whatever and get them to really talking, and they say it is a philosophical error to define the mind because the mind is undefinable. And so it isn't that these scientists or philosophers have disagreed with the definition I'm about to give you. They actually disagree with the act of defining. So what I say to them, even though I'm trained in science and I'm fascinated with philosophy, I say to them, as a practitioner, as a clinical practitioner, how can we call ourselves mental anything without defining the word? And how can we try to make something healthy if we don't know even what the thing is? Does that make sense? So I say to them, I said, you might be absolutely right. It may be a scientific error to define the mind. It may be a philosophical error to define the mind. But then we have nothing to do if we're mental health practitioners. Right? And there's a lot of suffering in the world. So there's a lot of people who really need our help. That's for sure, right? I mean, I wish we were unemployed. You know, I wish there were people who didn't need our help, but there's lots of suffering around. So here's the definition back in 1992 that I offered to 40 scientists from over a dozen different disciplines of science. And strangely enough, there was 100% agreement that this statement fit with their working world of how they were studying the mind, whether they were in anthropology, computer science, or neuroscience, and everything in between. So here it is, that the mind can be defined, at least a very central component of it. So a central feature of the mind can be defined as an embodied and relational process. So it's embodied, meaning it's not just in the skull, it's throughout the body, and it's not just in a single person, it happens in relationships. So it's embodied and relational, and it's a process, which means that the mind is not a noun. It's not a fixed entity like a rock. It actually is a moving, flowing, dynamic thing that's doing something. So it's a process, and it's a very specific process. It's a process that regulates something. And that thing which it regulates is energy and information. The flow of energy and information. So the mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow, that's the movement across time, of energy and information, period. And amazingly, everyone, without exception, in the room, said that works for me. Now, that was very useful in being the training director in child psychiatry because I could teach people in training about using this definition to think about not only what the mind is, but how do you help people see the mind so they can move their mind in a healthy direction. And to do that, you've got to, of course, go from this working definition of mind, and even if you disagree with it, at least it's a starting place to talk about one core feature of the mind. Because, of course, the mind has subjective feelings, and it has the feeling of consciousness and experience of connections and narrative and memory and everything else that you could talk about the mind. Of course it has those. So this is just a definition of a core feature of the mind. Now, once you say that it's regulatory, you can move someone from being able to do just willy-nilly about what the mind is doing and actually be very specific. If you were going to regulate your car, for example, how do you do it? You've got to first look, right? If someone blindfolds you, it'd be hard to regulate your car. So the first thing is you've got to see what it is you're regulating. Energy and information flow in this case. And then you've got to do what in a car? Shape the direction, right, by moving the steering wheel or pressing the accelerator or brakes. So you have to see and shape something to regulate it. You have to monitor it and you have to modify it. So in many ways, what this definition does for us in mental health or teachers in education is it allows them very specifically to say, I've got a student in my class or a client in my office, how do I help strengthen the mind of the individual or the group of individuals that I am working with? I want to help their minds develop. So at a very minimum, you say, yes, you need to help your client see energy and information flow with more clarity and stability, and then modify it with more strength and agility. That's the idea. So suddenly, I say to these scientists and philosophers, in mental health practice, we actually now have a handle on what we need to do in psychotherapy and education to help strengthen the mind of individuals. And the scientists and philosophers say, well, it's still an error because the mind is undefinable, or the mind should never be defined, or something like that. So I've had a lot of internal reflection. Some of my seminar students are here, and they know that I struggle with this because I want to honor all the giants that we stand upon in order to know what we know. But the fact is, for some reason, there's been kind of a stuck place in this thing that everyone calls a mystery of the mind. And I love the mystery of it, and I think trying to clarify the mystery doesn't make it more magical or less magical. It just lets us know more and do more with more efficiency. It's like they said to Willie Sutton, you know, where they said, Willie, why'd you rob the bank? He was in jail for robbing a bank. And what did Willie say? That's where the money is. So this is like the Willie Sutton approach to education and psychotherapy. Why not actually define the thing we're trying to develop and then develop it because that's where the money is? I mean, that's how I think. But I also want to warn you that it may be a philosophical and scientific error to do this. However, do people get better? People who use this approach. They do, you know, because actually you teach them about the mystery of their own subjective life and they can do something about it. So Mindsight is the capacity to see and shape the internal world. And now we have to go on to health.